With talks and a stalemate, what is the future of the Iran nuclear deal? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The U.S. State Department has called former President Donald Trump's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 a strategic blunder. It also said Washington has no desire to revive the agreement since Tehran cannot be trusted. But reports in Iranian and Israeli media indicate American officials are maintaining backchannel communications with their Iranian counterparts. Meanwhile, the European Union's foreign policy chief has stated there is no alternative to the nuclear deal, adding those who think otherwise simply fool themselves. In 2015, the U.S., UK, China, France, Germany, Russia, the European Union, and Iran agreed to this deal. It's called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. It's meant to ensure Tehran's nuclear program would be peaceful. 3 years later, the U.S. unilaterally walked away from the accord, with Iran facing economic headwinds and more sanctions from the West. Can the JCPOA be saved? To discuss this and much more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Pennsylvania, John Gasminian is the executive director of the University of Pennsylvania's Middle East Center. Out of the UK is Samuel Ramani. He's an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. And in Iran is Mohammad Marandi. He is the chair of the American Studies Department at the University of Tehran. I want to welcome all of you to the show. Mohammad, deal appears to be at a standstill. Talks have been off now for months. You've been there all along the way. As we enter 2023, where is Iran right now on this? Where do you see the country?
The negotiations in Vienna ultimately led to a text provided by the EU. And the EU foreign policy chief said he presented this through Mr. Mora to the different delegations. The delegations took the text back home to their different capitals, and the Iranians, after studying the text in great detail, they agreed to the text except for a number of changes that they felt were necessary. 3 or 4 small changes, but important for Iran. The Iranian response was called a reasonable, Mr. Joseph Borrell, the foreign policy chief of the EU, said that the Iranian demands were reasonable when he saw the Iranian response. And at that point, we thought we had a deal. Because after all, Mr. Borrell is a close ally of the United States. But then the United States gave a delayed response to the Iranian text, and their response was basically to buy time, I suppose. And it was ultimately because of the U.S. midterm elections. So what we have, where we are right now, is more or less where we were back then. We have a text, a final text, that the EU foreign policy chief agrees is reasonable. The Iranians agreed that it's reasonable, and we're waiting for the Americans to make a decision on that text. There really isn't much more to talk about. There's, of course, the issue of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Iran. The technical are negotiating. In the near future, we'll have the deputy head of the organization in Tehran. If the Americans want that to be sorted out, it can be sorted out as well. So basically, it's up to the United States to make a decision.
Okay, John, let me ask you about the U.S. Obviously, rejoining the JCPOA, a key component of the agreement, or the deal. But there's been conflicting signals coming from the U.S. Most recently, a video that kind of surfaced on social media shows Joe Biden kind of describing the JCPOA being about as dead as disco. Let's listen to what he had to say.
President Biden, could you please announce that JCPOA is dead? Can you just announce that?
No.
No, why not?
No. A lot of reasons. It is dead. We're not going to announce it. Long story.
Is it dead? No. It's sort of dead. Try and figure this thing out for us. I mean, where do you see the United States in 2023?
Yeah, I think, look, I think Joe Biden was probably caught off guard in that particular moment, but I think that, the truth is that JCPOA is dead and has been for quite some time. And I think we have to understand that in historical context. The original point of negotiating with Iran over its nuclear program in 2009, let's remember, okay, now 14 years ago was when President Obama came to office, was about the beginnings of a potentially political process of better relations with Iran. It was the idea behind it was to try to resolve a difficult, complicated technical issue that was standing between the two countries, and that it would be potentially the beginning of a larger process of rapprochement. That clearly never happened. It got very much mired into technical negotiations. Eventually, a JCPOA was signed in 2015, and then, of course, the Trump administration withdrew in 2018. I have always felt that it is very difficult for two countries like the United States and Iran that have such a deep history of animosity to try to come to an agreement over a complicated technical issue like Iran's nuclear program in the absence of a larger, meaningful political process of better diplomatic relations. The reality is the world has changed since the JCPOA. Iran is a nuclear-capable power. It doesn't have a bomb. But the only thing standing between Iran and a bomb is a decision, and that is a political decision for Tehran. A political decision needs to be dealt with politically, and I think that we have to remember that the circumstances are so dramatically different from where they were when this process began.
Sam, let me get your thoughts on this. We talked about this back in August, where it seemed like there were some signs of encouragement. You were on this broadcast. I think one of the reporters covering this was like, oh, they just have some fine tuning to do, deals in the offing. What's the position from the EU regards to this? Obviously, a lot of the European countries would like this to get finalized, get back to where it was in 2015. What's the sense there?
So when we spoke last time in August, absolutely, the European Union had just released a major statement about how it was trying to push forward for the JCPOA. I think by early September, we started really noticing a shift in the European Union's rhetoric. We saw, I believe, on the 5th of September, a statement coming from Borrell saying that the deal was in trouble, and then the EU admitting that on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly later that month, there would be no real progress towards any kind of negotiations or breakthrough. So since late September, I think the EU, even though it's maybe talking differently, maybe saying that this deal needs to be saved, has largely been operating under the same assumptions as the United States. That's really difficult to make this happen. And there have been two factors that have really made it more difficult and complicated it further. The first has been the issue of human rights in Iran, in particular the repression of women's rights, the repression of demonstrators. We've seen German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock be extremely vocal about this, support the imposition of access freezes and entry bans for Iranian officials, and then Iranians writing letters to European embassies, urging them to think about the broader relationship and try to keep things going. And the second has been obviously Iran's supply of drones, and now potentially, though it hasn't been confirmed yet, ballistic missiles of a 300-kilometer radius to Russia. And if the drones continue to flow in, the missiles eventually flow in, it's going to be very hard for the EU to break with the US and somehow support sanctions relief on the Iranians. So even though the EU is saying, oh, we want to separate the Iranian nuclear issue from human rights, from the issue of Russia, from ballistic missiles, from regional activities and all the other problems, in practice, the EU is really going on the course that it can't really do very much, and the deal is really on ice, even if it might speak a little bit more conciliatory about it than what we saw Biden say in the clip earlier.
Mohammed, I want to get your thoughts on what he just said.
Well, a couple of things. One is that when the JCPOA was signed in 2015, leader Ayatollah Khamenei said that if the United States abides by its commitments in good faith, we could start talking about other issues. But the United States decided not to do so. Obama, from day one, began to violate the deal. And the United States dragged its feet until Trump became president, and we know what he did. So the United States, the Iranians were showing goodwill to the United States. And this is not something that happened for the first time. After 9/11, the Iranians helped the United States with al-Qaeda, then they were called the Axis of Evil, and their previous occasions as well. For example, when Iran gave the United States an oil field in the Persian Gulf to the Conoco company, and then Iran was slapped with sanctions. We have numerous examples where the Iranians were attempting to move in the general direction of rapprochement and the United States did the exact opposite. With regards to human rights and with regards to drones and missiles, no one in Iran really takes that position by the EU seriously, because the EU and the United States have been targeting ordinary Iranians with maximum pressure sanctions for years now. Many Iranians have died as a result of a lack of certain medicines, machinery affiliated to hospitals, and or technical experts were unable to get the spare parts for important medical machines, and many people have died, and they continue to die as a result of EU and US policy. So no one here believes that. And in general, the JCPOA from the very beginning was designed to separate the nuclear standoff or the nuclear issue between Iran and Western countries and other issues so that it could be more easily resolved. And the Europeans don't have any will to take a stand on their own anyway. We saw that under Trump, that the EU was unwilling to take a stand, even though they at least verbally were opposed to Trump. So the decider, as Bush used to say, is in Washington. It is the United States. It is Biden that has to make that decision. And one final point that I'd like to make is that during the nuclear negotiations in Vienna, and I was present during those negotiations, Western governments constantly said that Iran has reached they are about to reach a certain point where after that, negotiations are meaningless. And we have to have an immediate deal, or a deal has to be prepared and signed immediately. Months have passed since those days, and now the Europeans and the Americans are silent. And that basically shows that back then it was propaganda. They were just trying to put pressure on Iran to give extra concessions. If the Iranian nuclear program was so dangerous, if it had reached a point of no return, then why is it that they have been so silent over the past few months? The reason why they've been silent is that they know Iran was not pursuing nuclear weapons, but they were using this as propaganda to put pressure on Iran.
Anton, let me bring you into the conversation. Sam says that two of the complications right now, human rights, as well as drones being supplied from Iran to Russia in their attempts to secure some of the areas in Ukraine. Obviously, Russia is a signatory to the JCPOA when the U.S. Left the agreement in 2018. Some of these complications that Sam's referring to weren't really on the table at that time. Can you describe how this has complicated things?
Sure. I think we need to look at the broader picture in answering that question. Let me point to two specific things. First of all, in 1997, a very influential book came out by Zbigniew Brzezinski about the grand chessboard. And it envisioned a future during America's unipolar moment in which the United States was going to be the arbiter of the destiny of all of Eurasia, pursuing its vital national security interests. And it's interesting to note now that the people living in Eurasia are finally sort of making their voices heard about the simple fact that to them, Eurasia is not a grand chessboard, it's their home. Number two, when Joe Biden was just recently in Saudi Arabia, he dropped a phrase which I'm not sure if it was part of a speech or whether he was ad-libbing, about the United States not allowing a vacuum of power to appear in the Middle East and in Saudi Arabia specifically, for the Chinese or anyone else to fill in. And I can imagine that the Saudis weren't very happy about listening to themselves described as an empty space within their own home. So I think what's happening more broadly in the Middle East is that we're seeing the gradual regionalization of security issues because the people who used to be the adults in the room, and that's the United States and the Europeans, can't seem to get their act together. You led in, Mike, with a quote from the State Department where out of one side of its mouth, it criticizes the Trump administration for withdrawing from the JCPOA, and out of the other side of its mouth, it says that Iran shouldn't be trusted. Well, either the withdrawal is a strategic mistake or Iran shouldn't be trusted. and therefore the deal was bad to begin with. But you can't have it both ways. So for the Russians, the general policy now is to simply work directly with all of the members within the greater Middle East, the Iranians, the Saudis, the Syrians, the Turks, and everyone else who's willing to come to the table, and to start settling these issues directly in a bilateral or multilateral way without involving the United States or even the Europeans.
So, John, give me a sense of what you make of what Anton just said, that there's been this huge geopolitical shift, if you will, where the U.S. and perhaps Europe aren't as important on the landscape.
No, I mean, I think that's undoubtedly correct. And I think we see that in the state of the JCPOA negotiations as well, or whatever is left of JCPOA negotiations. I mean, in a sense, this is the point I was trying to make. I mean, for both countries, for both Iran and for the United States, this is simply not a priority in the way that it used to be. But neither can really admit that that the process is dead, or that, you know, everyone sort of continues to pay lip service to the JCPOA process. It's beginning to remind me of, it's sort of in the early days of, I think, turning into the Arab-Israeli peace process, which is just sort of to say a lot of process without a lot of peace, a lot of talk, negotiations for the sake of negotiations, everyone sort of saying that this is the working document, but in reality, we all know that the train has left the station, and there's no serious conversation taking place around this. But there's almost been a sort of industry, a JCPOA industry that's grown up over the last few years, that sort of says any conversation about Iran, any conversation about Iran's relations with the great powers and with the United States has to begin with the JCPOA. Again, I think that was maybe true a few years ago, but circumstances have changed. Obviously, Iran's facing much, much bigger and more complex challenges today. Obviously, with the recent protests and human rights issues, it's even more difficult politically for the Biden administration to do a new deal with Iran. And, you know, frankly, Iran and the JCPOA have moved significantly down the list of priorities in Washington. And I think partly that's because of a sort of tacit, unacknowledged recognition that Iran has become, in a sense, a nuclear-capable power that could race to a bomb if it chose to, very, very quickly, thus making the original purpose of the JCPOA relatively irrelevant. I mean, we still sort of say, oh, we want to go back to JCPOA to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. I mean, the reality is, if we wanted to do that, we would have taken the whole process much more seriously, much earlier on. And the same is true on the Iranian side, where they sort of always say, oh, we're open to negotiations and so on. But in reality, you know, the current administration in Iran certainly doesn't see any real tangible benefit to a serious dialogue with the United States in the way that the previous administrations did in 2009 to 2015, because they saw it as the beginning of potentially a larger process of coming out of cold and out of isolation and better relations with the West and so on. I think Iran has given up on that and is now considering more strategically its relations with Russia or China or some of its other regional actors. I'm sure they would like to see sanctions relief, obviously. That's probably Iran's most pressing priority in terms of what it can get out of the JCPOA. But those priorities, when you think about it, are actually quite different from where we started 14 years ago.
Sam, let me talk to you about what he just said. You know, no tangible benefit for Iran, but I think, you know, if you look in the West, at least at the United States, that also is probably a correct assessment. I mean, when you look at Biden, a lot of people are saying there's not going to be a deal before the midterms. It's not. That would come back to haunt the Democrats if they were able to work out a deal. The Republicans would hammer them about that. You have a presidential election in the offing. What's the tangible benefit from the United States, given what John just said?
Yeah, I think definitely I would agree with that. I think that electoral politics is going to play a major role in restraining America's ability to really negotiate and to push for this. And in fact, there was some academic research that was done by one of the professors, my colleagues over at Oxford, Professor Louise Fawcett, who actually looked at this and says that during the first terms of American presidential administrations, deals like what we've seen with Iran are hard to come by. It'd probably be easier to do in a second term without the re-election pressure. So I think that, yes, the combination of the Republican Congress and the election will make it extremely unlikely for the Americans to forge along here. But just in response to some of the other points that we were talking about with regards to Iran's pivot, I think that Iran is definitely, under Abraham Raisi, embracing its partnerships with Russia a lot more closely, its partnerships with China under the 30-year agreement, as well as branching out to other areas of the global south. Like we're seeing the elevation of Africa, Latin America, and other theaters as central to their policy. That doesn't mean they don't want to be relieved, but the imperative is not really there, and the compromises that they're willing to make are also a lot less. And finally, there's the issue of the one carrot that if Iran had the ability to supply oil or gas in significant quantities to Europe during this time, it might be able to have a bargaining chip. But the reality is, given the way the Iranian pipeline infrastructures are moving, given the fact that the main connectivity for Iran is on the north-south transit corridor, which is integrating with Eurasia and not with the West, the Europeans are not really going to be looking towards Iran for supplies. They're looking towards Qatar. They're looking towards Algeria. So that means that I think that Iran cannot really offer the West that much that would cause them to really make this more rapid. So the inflation issue is not going to trigger this. And the Americans just have too many electoral issues. So that's why I think it's going to be pretty much stagnant all around.
And Mohammed, you said in a recent interview that the main obstacle for the U.S. is making a political decision. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, it was quite clear that before the midterm elections, the United States didn't want to make that decision. And I think that many of my Western colleagues, even back then, before the period preceding the midterm elections, they too were saying that the Americans, it will be difficult for them, for someone like Biden to make a decision anyway. And that was during the negotiations in Vienna. For Iran, there are a number of things that are important. One is that when the United States violated the deal under Obama, the Iranians, they committed themselves to the deal. And when Trump tore up the deal, the Iranians continued to abide by all of their obligations for a year. And then only after that did they decrease their commitments in order to put pressure on the Europeans, to put pressure on the Americans, which didn't work. So the Iranians just went back to expanding their peaceful nuclear program. But another point is that the current administration, while they're open to a deal, because they negotiated very, very hard for 3 months in good faith in Vienna, but the current administration, as pointed out earlier by my colleagues, they are not going to, unlike the previous administration, they're not going to wait. They've moved and joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They will probably move to join BRICS. They're expanding relations with Central Asia, Russia, China, India, and neighboring countries. But also the fact that the Iranian government has already been burnt once is a big issue. And the second issue is the recent interview by the former German chancellor. When she spoke about the Minsk Accords, Minsk 1 and 2, she said basically in the interview that it was never really serious. They wanted to buy time for the Ukrainians. And that didn't go down well in Tehran either, especially when Hollande afterwards said the same thing. And so many Iranian officials are saying, well, we were already cheated once after 2015. They themselves openly say that they were not serious about peace during the Minsk negotiations. So how can we trust them again next time around? But in any case, Iran's official policy is and will continue to be that if the United States accepts the current text that is acceptable both to Iran and the EU foreign policy chief, then we can sign a deal.
Anton, I saw you nodding your head as he was talking about Minsk Accords and JCPOA. So I want to get your sense on how this has changed. It kind of feeds to what you were saying earlier about how, you know, it used to be that the United States and Europe could apply pressure and you could get these accords, but it seems as though things really have shifted, haven't they?
Mike, I think we're all living through a transition point, a world vanishing and a world coming into being. And there's, by the way, nothing romantic or pleasant about it. Transition periods are always full of instability. But the days of America's unipolar moment of Western hegemony on our planet are disappearing. Mohammed mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. Understandably, there's a lot of talk these days about NATO expansion, but the world's fastest growing organizations are actually the SCO and then BRICS afterwards. And if you look at the amount of the world's population that is represented by the governments that are members of these organizations, they by far eclipse the so-called golden billion, the global West, so to speak. So, as I mentioned before, the Russians, the Iranians, and now the Saudis, the Turks, the Syrians, and everyone else in Eurasia are simply moving ahead in their own direction. The Russians are thinking in terms of the greater Eurasia project. They'll be happy to see the Europeans, even the Americans, all of the North Americans, including the Canadians, become part of that project. But the rules by which the game is played will be determined by all of its players, not exclusively by the West. And this seems to me to be the dominant trend of the 21st century, of 2023. And the Ukrainian crisis, tragic as it is, has really acted as a catalyst for a process that actually began before the overthrow of the Yanukovych regime in Kiev in 2014. And the war is simply speeding up what was already afoot.
Mohammed, let me get your sense, because you talked about the Vienna negotiations. Having been there and witnessed this, how would you describe this roller coaster ride? I mean, were you encouraged at times, discouraged? Did you hold out hope? What were your thoughts as the process unfolded?
Well, there were lots of ups and downs. The Vienna talks were basically talks to prevent the JCPOA from being torn up again or from being violated. In other words, they were building mechanisms to protect the JCPOA, to create incentives for the United States to stay within the deal, but also to make it costly for the United States to violate the deal. And so the negotiations were very difficult because obviously the Americans and the Europeans wanted ambiguities in the text. They wanted the mechanisms so that they could basically outmaneuver Iran and hypothetically violate the deal later on without paying any significant cost. So obviously, with the history and the antagonism and the mistrust that exists, there were lots of ups and downs. But I think that there were 2 points where at least the Iranian delegation thought that we almost had a deal. One was when we were leaving Vienna the last time. At that time, when the text provided by the EU foreign policy chief was being discussed on the plane home, it was clear that most of what Iran wanted was in the text. So there was a huge shift from where we were at the beginning of the negotiations and on that day. And the Iranians felt that we were close. Then when they went to Tehran, and as I said earlier, they made some changes or they proposed certain changes, and then Mr. Borrell called them reasonable, that was also a high point. And then, of course, after that, things went downhill. So I cannot say what the intentions are in Washington and how serious the United States really was, because only the Americans would know that. But the perception in Tehran was that we were very close, and we continue to be close. But as your other guests rightly point out, Iran, the priorities have changed.
Yep.
But I think it's, priorities for Iran have changed. But I think it's not a very smart policy for the United States and the Europeans to continue to antagonize so many different powers at the same time. On the one hand, they provoke China, then they're at war with Russia, basically, and then they want to antagonize Iran. Basically, what they're doing is they're pushing all these different countries closer to each other. And as said earlier, this is acting as a catalyst.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. I can't thank you enough. Great discussion. Really appreciate it. We're going to have to leave it there. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for watching another edition of The Heat.